Good afternoon and welcome to the second session of the PRCA Health Conference. I'm Nathan McGlone and I'm your glamorous host for this session. Thank you all for taking the time to join in today. We don't have to worry about double vaccine, masks or social distance, but I know you all have busy days. So thanks a lot for joining and taking the time out to do that. And I hope you look forward to hearing the thoughts of our esteemed panel. It's a real pleasure to host a session for the PRCA Health Conference. Every year the conference tries to look at the most kind of prevalent and important topics that are affecting those of us who work in healthcare communications, and this year is no different. Obviously, without doubt, the most important issue is COVID, but how we move on from COVID. So this year we're trying to discuss how we in communications can kind of learn, adapt and progress as we move into a post-pandemic world. This session is very much looking towards the future in healthcare communications post-pandemic. Even though I think some of us would agree we're kind of not 100% there yet, there is, touch wood, light at the end of the tunnel. So before we start, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's had a hand in organising the conference as a whole and this session. I'd like to thank my panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to join and give us their insights. And also to Vulio, our conference sponsor. Without our sponsors, we would never be able to do anything like this. So we appreciate them helping us out and giving us this opportunity. If anyone has any questions or anything at all that they want to ask, please feel free to share it through the beauty of Zoom chat. And I'll pick up a few towards the end of the session, but feel free to just ping them across as they come to mind. You could also reflect on any of our discussions by posting on social media using the hashtag PRCA Health Conf. That's conf, C-O-N-F. So please feel free to disagree, agree, comment on anything you hear today, comment on people's backgrounds, who's got the best one, and show you are a devout follower of the cause that is healthcare communications. One final point before we head into the introductions of our panel. For those who are planning to attend yesterday's session, Reimagining Health Policy in a Post-COVID World, unfortunately, we had to move that session due to some unforeseen circumstances. This session today was supposed to be best till last, but it's now, we will have another session next week. So fear not, if you do want to attend that Reimagining Health Policy session, that will be next week on the 29th, 12:30, and that'll be your final chance to hear for some great panelists as part of the PRCA Health Conference. So too much rabbiting on from me. We're going to start with some introductions. So this is our panel. Mr. Henderson, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly, Nathan, and thanks very much for inviting me along to this. It's a very interesting and important topic, I think. So my name is Ian Henderson, and I have two lots of experience to bring to this, one of which is in communications, having been part of agencies and run agencies for quite a long time, and also as a client of Aurora Communications, that fine body of men and women, in my role as co-founder of a testing startup last year. We felt it was a good thing to do, and we could do testing in a way that was perhaps more consumer friendly than some. So saliva, not spit, and couriers and results out. So it's called Halo, and we set it up last year. We're now ISO accredited with a lab in White City, Trustpilot score of 4.3, which is excellent apparently, and we work with some fairly major companies. It's a new experience for me, being part of a healthcare organization, and I'm not a scientist, but I do know a bit about communications and product design. So it's been a really fascinating journey, and actually being involved in an organization which is trying to do something sensible in a very complex and difficult and new market has been really exciting. And the fact that you're actively involved in something you see on the front of every newspaper every day is quite something. So it's been quite a journey, and we are very grateful to Nathan and his colleagues for the help and support they've given us over the last half a year.
Well, that's lovely to say. Thank you, Ian. The check, as always, is very much in the post, and that probably quote will make the website. Maya? Yeah, that'll be it.
So I'm Maya Anaokar, and I am head of communications and marketing at the Patients Association, which I only joined in June of this year, although I'd been volunteering with them all the way through lockdown to give them some support, because they're only a small team. We are only a small team. And I joined them from the Vaccines Task Force, where I had been since the end of August last year, working primarily on the Human Challenge Programme, which some of you may have seen in the news over primarily probably the autumn and the new year, as well as working as part of the communications teams that were talking and launching the vaccines. So that's me in a nutshell, but I have a background both as a medical journalist and, as Nathan alluded to, working in various agencies over the years, but always in healthcare. I was a health journalist, and I've always been a health communicator.
One of the best as well. And finally, Annalise.
Hi. Thanks, Nathan, and thank you everybody for joining our session today. I'm Annalise Cody. I'm Group President International at Real Chemistry. I've been with Real Chemistry for 8 years, and that was when I made my first foray into healthcare. And prior to that, for at least 15 years, I was doing comms in practically every other area apart from healthcare. So some of the conversations we're going to have today about new entrants into the healthcare market are particularly poignant for me. But my role at Real Chemistry is, as I said, to run our international business, and that really means focusing on our team, our recruitment, our clients, the new offerings and partnerships that we need to keep driving forward in what I really see as one of the most exciting times in this industry. I think the pandemic has created a huge amount of opportunity, and it's almost an embarrassment of riches. And at Real Chemistry, the way we kind of focus down to make sure we're going where we can have the most impact is because we think about being driven by data first. We're a digital first company. We're very much focused on healthcare. We don't have other industries that we're particularly focused on as an agency. We really believe in using creative problem solving and very much focused on bringing healthcare equity and access to the work that we do for clients and also for our pro bono work. So really excited to be here today.
Thank you. So Annalise, first kind of question, I think, to you, and I'll bring this to the other panelists as well. Obviously, the pandemic affected our lives immeasurably, numerous different ways that we can't even count, and for other people as well. For you, working communications in your position at Real Chemistry, what was the most significant impact of the pandemic on you, and how has that maybe changed the way you sort of see your role and see our role in healthcare communications?
I would just say the absolute biggest impact was actually just having to respond to the transformational forces that the pandemic actually accelerated, which meant healthcare changed enormously almost overnight. We had all these things we've been waiting for the last 10 years to happen, and suddenly there was telehealth, suddenly there was online medical meetings and conferences. We've moved to virtual clinical trials, digital drug launches, digital enabled sales forces, and something that's close to my heart, real world evidence data collection. So just a huge amount of transformation that I think almost happened in 6 weeks, and having to manage that on behalf of clients and also the team and the business. I can say that we did that very successfully, and we grew 3 times really during the pandemic, and we've onboarded something like 150 people to respond to the requests from our clients to help them in this change. And this change, I really do feel that we're at the forefront of the new industrial revolution, because the focus on healthcare with the continuation of COVID and vaccine interest, new therapies coming through, the fact that people haven't been able to, say, have their operations, people are still very much focused on it. And now there is even more pressure on having a cost-effective, value-based, accessible solution to healthcare. So that is going to mean completely new approaches. So we're going to have to completely keep thinking about how we bring those to market. We help bring some technology firms that perhaps have not entered the healthcare market before. It's going to be increasingly focused on data and making sure that we can be patient-centric, outcomes-driven. We're looking at personalized approaches. So that does mean we need data insights, but I actually think the role of communicators is even more important than it's ever been before, because while we have all this data that can inform our strategy, we can't make those emotional connections to build the meaningful relationships to get people to think about their health, move forward, take the right drugs to have either an impact or a cure. We're not going to make it. So that storytelling is so important. So I'm always talking to the team about, we've got to balance the data with a little bit of soul to stand out. So with all of that, as a company, we brought our 12 acquisitions together under Real Chemistry because we felt we were better together as those data-driven, soul-driven storytellers. And that was really to help us address the end-to-end pharma needs, both in clinical, commercial, and corporate. So not just seeing things isolated, really thinking about the whole picture of how a molecule comes to market and beyond. And of course, that meant hiring and training, like I said, the significant amount of people we brought on board to actually really bring this integrated team together to help clients through these unprecedented changes. And that's really helped us hire a more diverse workforce. We have people who continue to work from home, and we're very much operating a hybrid model. So much change, but so much opportunity. Wouldn't have kind of pandemic was based, I think, have a silver lining, but I don't, that's not negating the impact that it has had on many people, but there has been a huge amount of opportunity to drive us forward.
No, I think you've made some excellent points there that we are 100% touching on as we go through this session. And I think if I could be described later in my career as a data-driven, soul-driven storyteller, I think I would be pretty happy. Maya, just to kind of get your perspective through the pandemic, and I'd like to touch on it in a second, you had the role in the vaccines task force, which was something quite incredible, I think quite enviable for some of us who worked in comms, but then also transitioned over into the Patients Association and helping them. What did you kind of feel the most significant impacts from your perspective in comms, and what did the pandemic have on you?
Me personally, or do you think just what you're interested in, healthcare comms generally? Or
healthcare comms, I would say, is your role in healthcare comms.
I would say that the pandemic elevated, healthcare communications to such a level where you'd have a health story on the front page of every newspaper every day, where it would lead off, the 10 o'clock bulletins. And I think that was a really big change to what we'd got used to in terms of healthcare and storytelling, especially, say, for those of us who have a background in trying to sell in pharmaceutical stories to consumer press. So all of a sudden here were news gathering organisations interested in what vaccines manufacturers were doing, which I think was quite a change from how particularly vaccine development, had been thought of in the past. And I know from speaking to the companies developing the COVID vaccines, and also to colleagues who work in NHS comms, that these were massive challenges for them to suddenly ramp up to be communicating. So, for example, within NHS comms officers were having to communicate not just with patients around what was happening if you couldn't come into hospital, if you couldn't have visitors, if you were in hospital, but also internally with staff, because staff were fearful. Staff were still expected to go in and work in GP surgeries and work in hospitals. what does that mean for them? So NHS communicators in particular had massive challenges and needed to really, to Annalise's point, look at digital as a way of rapidly disseminating accurate information. In terms of the vaccine task force, what's interesting about the task force is I don't think if we weren't able to work remotely, we would have been able to do as much as we did. So we were entirely a remote team. The vaccines task force was part of BAYS, not the Department of Health. And those offices in Victoria were closed. So nobody could go in there. So everybody was working from home, which meant a number of things. It meant that I never met any of my colleagues. The first time I met most of my colleagues was this September at a big vaccines task force reunion at Kew Gardens earlier this month. So we had to do all that norming, storming and forming of teams online over Teams, which is what the government prefers because it's more secure than Teams. And getting to know people, know their working styles. For me, it was about understanding some of the government ways of working, which were new to me. I'd worked for the NHS at a local and a central level in NHS comms, but even that isn't like Department of Health comms or BAYS comms or whatever. So that was interesting in that sense. But I think with the success of the vaccine rollout, vaccine procurement, it shows that you can do it. You can bring together people and use the best of digital technology to not only conduct some very high level negotiations, set up trials, do all of those sorts of things, and communicate and keep the general public and going and communicate with them and let them know what you're doing and how you're doing it and when they can expect to see their vaccines, which of course people were very, very keen on. They wanted to know when they were going to get them. So it was great to be part of that. It's been one of the most interesting jobs I've ever had, and I've had some interesting jobs.
You certainly have. And then Ian, obviously coming at it from a slightly different perspective, obviously you in your role as a communications lead, but also as setting up a new kind of health startup. Obviously the pandemic played a kind of a very different role for you, but obviously you had to set up a communications process and force to try and make the public aware of your new product, which was an entirely new industry, be it a PCR test. How did you kind of go about that, and what were the kind of the impacts and barriers and learnings to communications on that?
It's been quite a journey. I think if a year and a half ago you told me that I would be invited to a webinar on healthcare comms, I'd have been a little surprised. I'd have been quite a lot more surprised to hear that I was going to be on TV news talking about the impact of the removal of PCR testing on travel. These are new experiences for me. Between then and now, I've set up startups before, and I've kind of been responsible for the origination of brands and creation of new products and that kind of thing. And that was kind of originally my involvement, which, as a lockdown hobby, was actually quite interesting and fun because it's kind of what I do. But what was unexpected was the level of commitment that became necessary to get this thing off the ground, and the steepness of the learning curve in doing that. So, not only learning enough about science to get away with it. It's okay. There are real scientists involved, but also kind of the business side of it and the the complexity, not just of the science itself and setting up a sequencing lab and partnering with UCL and the Francis Crick and hiring PhDs to run these sequencing machines and all of that, while managing a pretty uncertain, anxious, and occasionally troublesome customer base. That became, it's been quite involved and fascinating, and I haven't enjoyed all of it. That would be an exaggeration, but it has been really, really exciting to do. So I guess this, the answer to your question really is, how has it affected me? Quite a lot is the answer. And I'm kind of, I'm still doing my other things with communications as well. So actually managing my time and learning the advantages of being able to jump from meeting to meeting with nanoseconds in between, rather than a taxi across town, has been quite fun as well. I think to your point about what it means for healthcare comms more broadly, I think if you told me, or if I told you that a company like ours would be using channels like TikTok to reach people who actually need to do testing when they're going to Ibiza, which, and they really do need it. But actually using channels like TikTok and other social media platforms like Instagram and so on as a real, viable, and effective way of reaching new audiences, educating them about what to do, and selling product to them is quite a change as well. And I think that is probably, for me, the perhaps biggest shift, as Annalise and I are both talking about. This kind of, Annalise called it a new industrial revolution. I think that's not far off. I mean, with all of these technologies that are now coming together, and it is a massive transformation. I think, just to sort of try and characterize that with other sectors, if you look at the shift from traditional high street banking to fintechs, I think we're seeing a very, very similar shift in healthcare. And I think COVID, lockdown, and the technology coming together and the availability of sequencing of vaccines has just absolutely made that explode. And I think you can look at other sectors which are perhaps a few years ahead, like transition from banking to fintech, as to what might happen here. And one of the big shifts is going to be the use of channels like TikTok and Instagram and so on to reach audiences, because it is that direct outreach rather than intermediated, which is going to be one of the biggest shifts, I think.
I think I'd be very tempted to agree with that. I think that's what we want to cover. The germs of this session is that there is going to be a change, and we're already seeing kind of new avenues opening up generally in healthcare, but I think to us in healthcare comms, I think there's new kind of opportunities and new ways of communicating, ones that we might not have seen 18 months ago, but certainly wouldn't have seen maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I think, Annalise, kind of as you made the point, I'll come to you first. If we are on the brink of a new revolution in terms of healthcare, and you've touched on how you've had to kind of transform real chemistry during the pandemic period to kind of prepare for how we're doing things differently, how do we go on from here in healthcare comms to prepare for that? What's your feeling in terms of what do you think we need to do to be ready for what could be a landmark moment for healthcare communications?
Well, I think it comes back to what we've been talking about, and I love that the comparison that Ian is making between traditional banking and fintech, which actually was where I was before. So it's got a lot of analogous and correlates, whatever the right word is for that. But I think in terms of us as a communications group of professionals, we have to in fact embrace the fact that change will continue. We are only at the start. And so if I think about some of the kind of RFPs that I'm seeing coming through that we're having to respond to. I think that's a good indication of what's now and what we're looking to in the future. We're definitely seeing around digital delivery and innovation. And by that, you come back and reflect actually on what Ian's saying. This really comes back to the being highly segmented and personalized in our approach to communications. That does mean we need to be data driven. So we need to be thinking about our audience, very specifically down to our audience. What is it they want to see? Where do they want to see it? What do they want it to be? Do they want it to be podcasts? They want it to be music? So everything is down to making sure that you can have some interaction with that individual person. And that could be as an HCP, or it could be as an HCP in their personal life. So I do love, we're definitely seeing what Ian is seeing, even in traditional pharma, the use of new channels. Some go, some don't. I love that Clubhouse was all the rage, I think, at the beginning of this year, and kind of petered out maybe, but that's part of what I look for my social and paid media team, is to keep us up to date as to what's coming through, test it, try it. We've got some great clients who will act as pilots to see, what is the right medium to connect with either patients, the caregivers, payers. Each group has a different way of what they want to see. And through that, we do have to apply artificial intelligence and machine learning. And clients are asking to see that in our responses to their RFPs. They want to see innovation. They themselves, as pharma companies, are going through this significant transformation across their entire business, from clinical trials all the way through to commercialization and corporate. They want to be with agencies that really understand what they're going through to transform into, farm tech or whatever we want to call it. I think as part of that as well, just building, we do need to deliver the right experiences at the right time. Again, taking a kind of the cue from our more consumer-led companies. So we are being asked for much more significant levels of design and creative to really optimize not only our product and corporate communications, but also our data comms. How can we make them more engaging and exciting in that first 3 seconds? So we really and I really feel that comes from the consumerization of healthcare. So we have really started to have to build teams who can think about the experience from different elements, whether that's in integrated comms, whether in med ed, UX, through our tech-enabled or creative capabilities, to really think about what can we do from maybe a virtual reality perspective, single channel, multi-channel, omni-channel. It's all about, what is that experience that stakeholder needs to see. And we're starting to see that we've started to win awards for the omni-channel experience with our in reflected in Cannes and Communique and Clio. So that's also great for our clients. They need to see the proof points. I probably should say, for anybody that's kind of attending who isn't a healthcare expert, we all know that our clients don't necessarily want to be the first. They'd like to be kind of lead. They never necessarily want to be the leader. So it's always good to see these awards come through to help clients understand where they could go, and help teams in recruitment. And then probably another area I would lean into is professional development for medical professionals. That went online very, very quickly, and we've seen more use of technology and data to really enhance the experience, but also check the comprehension. And that's really to help engage HCPs over multiple countries in very different therapeutic areas. And we've definitely seen possibly a much better engagement and better education experience actually on the digital platforms. But I would say these are just a couple of examples. I think how we're responding to has to be with an integrated approach. Our clients are in silos. Silos don't win. We have to help them connect the dots by bringing an integrated team together, all the way through from clinical to med affairs to market access, policy, and then more into the commercial teams with the product, corporate communications, lifecycle management. So I think the more dimensional you can make it, the more impact you will have. So those are the kind of things that are keeping me up at night, but they're good things.
Happy things, at least. Good challenges. To flip it on its head a little bit, and I'll bring in the rest of the panel on this as well. Working in the pharmaceutical industry, we are obviously highly regulated. We have to be very, very careful. Our audiences, we need to manage them very carefully. Do you think that generates a natural conservatism that maybe in our practices in communications, sometimes it's safer and easier to take that road where there's a lot less risk because no one's going to get hurt from it. Do you think that then is going to clash against what we've been saying and what we think is right now a positive and a progression potentially filled time for healthcare communications? Do you think that conservatism that might be ingrained in some of us, and I can speak from personal experience, it's different, that fear factor is definitely there. Do you think that is going to kind of butt heads against our ability to change as healthcare communicators, change as we need to?
Is that directed to me?
That is directed to you.
Yes, no, yes, I think it's an easy excuse to not push over. I do think it's an easy excuse not to push. Now, that's not to say that we definitely, with clients, have degrees of clients who are willing to take risk, without a shadow of a doubt. And we definitely see that in terms of data and insights, what can be collected, curated and managed, and how far they will go, say, with audience mapping, customer journey mapping, things like that. We've worked very hard to find corollaries that won't, are data neutral, data agnostic. But what we tend to find is we push with the clients who we know will lead, so the followers can see somebody else has done it. So, if I was, kind of a new entrant into the world of healthcare, I would be wanting to help my clients think about a couple of things. And I think Ian touched on one, really grounding the story in the science. That makes a huge difference to key stakeholders across the board, including investors. If you can really ground the story in the science and build from there, even if it is hugely creative. I think the other element that Ian talked about is partnership ecosystems. You can never do it alone. So how can we help maybe non-traditional healthcare clients come into ecosystems to make them successful? I do think there's an element of working with clients so they understand what they can and cannot do from a data privacy and also an MLR perspective. I don't think that necessarily stops things. And we've seen new technologies coming through like Anthill, which enables you to curate within the Viva environment, so you can rapidly produce content in response to what's going on to your stakeholders' experience. So I think there's technology out there that can help us act more like a consumer company. And then I think the other element that I'm seeing more and more is around value. I think we mentioned at the beginning, maybe if you're just a tech company or a mobile company, you measure in terms of revenue and EBITDA. We have to measure around value of life and how and value to the healthcare system, value to society. So how do we help new companies coming into the healthcare industry show their value so they can essentially be able to do business? So I think that's really key.
Maya, just with your experience of kind of dealing with the pharmaceutical industry, but obviously now in kind of your new role as the patient association, which may be a partner for pharmaceutical companies. I know you do partner with different pharmaceutical companies to do new work as we move into this post-pandemic arena. Would you agree with that? Do you think there is some kind of conservatism, but it's maybe an excuse to maybe be a little bit safe? And do you think there is a potential to kind of change and do different work? And with the end user we should always be thinking of the patient. So how are we going to make all this work to work for them? Do you think that kind of opportunity is open to us?
I think it definitely is. I mean, I think the pharmaceutical companies your big ones are conservative, not all of them, but a lot of them. You get the ones that are family owned that are perhaps a little bit more forward looking, but it is a regulated industry and they don't particularly want to be sidetracked by a complaint that they've breached code. It's not a good use of their staff's time to be dealing with the ABPI and the PCMIA, is it? So that's part of it, and Annalise was absolutely right. They don't want to be the leader, but they would quite like to lead. But we know, if you look at the stats of what people are doing and how they're using digital, it was like when social media started, the pharmaceutical industry was far behind. In terms of digital, that's quite an interesting one if you consider digital in all walks of life. So as I said, the BTF wouldn't have been able to work if it hadn't been for the ability to meet on Teams. The Patients Association, we do a lot of focus groups. We flipped those to online as soon as we could and helped people who had never been on Teams, had never used Zoom, to do that. And that worked quite well. But where digital isn't working well from a patient's perspective is in the delivery of healthcare. And this, and Matt Hancock last year in the summer, when he said that primary care was going to be digital first, that caused a great deal of alarm, not just amongst patients, but amongst GPs. You know, there was things on Twitter where people were saying, well, is he going to buy me a new camera? Is he going to buy me any camera? Is, you know, where's the tech going to come from? What about bandwidth? And as we know, that's not how things have worked out. And also in terms of digital consultations, they're just not happening. If you look at the statistics, video consultations are less of 0.5% of all GP consultations. And the vast majority of non-face-to-face consultations is the old-fashioned way over the phone. So, you know, digital offers a great many opportunities, but you have to take patients with you, and you have to understand what the limits of some patients are, and that for something like talking about intensely personal health problems, mental health problems, many people are always going to prefer to sit in a room with the nurse, with the doctor, with the healthcare provider, and talk to them directly. So I'm not saying there's a limit to what you can do with digital, but if you don't take the patients with you, it's not going to work well. It might work for the healthcare professionals, but given that they're providing a service to the patients, they need to encourage the patients to take advantage and see that there is an advantage for doing it in a certain way.
From your perspective, do you think us in healthcare communications, what can we do to maybe help patients, kind of encourage them to embrace the potential digital avenues that are open to them? Obviously, there's always going to be cases where people will want to do it face to face. They want to see the healthcare professional in a doctor's surgery. Do you think is there anything that we do partnering with the pharmaceutical industry or partnering with new?
Well, what I would recommend is, if you are thinking about something that's digital, you should be talking to patients before you progress too far down that road, to find out what it is that patients would find of value in that particular configuration that you're thinking of. And don't come to them when it's almost done and expect them to feed back on it. The strategy for the Patients Association, which we launched at the beginning of the year, is all about patient partnership. And it's patient partnership from one-to-one consultations and dealings right through to the design of health services, not just, you know, individual pieces. And so we would really like to see everybody working in partnership, consulting with patients or carers. If you're, you know, perhaps talking about something in dementia where perhaps, I mean, you should be talking to people with dementia, but, you know, there comes a point where they're not able to contribute, but to their carers, to find out what would be helpful and what would work. Otherwise, you're just going to get a lot of, you know, digital stuff that, if it's online, it's going to be digital tumbleweed. If it's an app, it's not going to get used. And we know that people download apps and don't use them. You know, the promise of M Health from a decade ago, that was slow off the ground. And the stuff that survived is stuff that people use and want. So my tip is, develop a focus group or find people who can deliver you a focus group of patients, and talk to, and try, you know, and look for those communities that you don't normally speak to if you want them to have equitable access to healthcare.
Ian, as kind of you've taken the reins of a company that's in the healthcare space and is dealing with people kind of on a very much a digital level, and were you surprised, first of all, by kind of the amount of kind of regulation and sort of hoops you had to jump through for Halo as a company? And then did you find being able to communicate something scientifically, did you find that it was quite easy to kind of frame that story? Or did you find that kind of the audience was open to it, or did you find that to be quite a challenge?
Well, specifically for Halo, I mean, I think the yes, the clearly it has to be a highly regulated industry, and it absolutely should be, because otherwise people's lives are at risk, and we don't want that. I think I was surprised by perhaps some of the seemingly unnecessary bureaucracy that seems to attract. I went to, UCAS is a wonderful organisation in many ways, and we're very happy to have their ISO accreditation. But goodness me, they do like a form filling in, and it's a seriously complicated process, and to some extent it needs to be, but I think there are probably better ways of doing it. And again, going back to the sort of banking fintech analogy, which is a little way ahead, that is also a highly regulated, highly intermediated industry. And what's happened there is that there are still enormous organizations which are inherently conservative, the big banks, for example, and they do find it difficult to respond to change, to be brave, and to embrace technology and new forms of communication with their audiences. And quite often what they do is buy fintechs to replace it. But the contrast is very clear, where if you look at Monzo or Revolut or all these sort of newcomers to that sector, what they do is they communicate with their audiences in the way that those audiences want to be communicated with. And I think that's the big shift from push to pull, right? So drawing the analogy into this sector, I think it can suit big organizations very well to, as you say, Maya, to kind of deliver an app, right, which is not fit for purpose, which is not what people actually want to use, and it gets rejected. However, if it's looked at from the other end of the telescope and the audience says, I want to communicate in this way, then that's absolutely what they should be providing. One small example, I'll give you two examples actually. One is a charity called, I think it's called Shout, and it's designed to help teenagers who are at suicide risk, which you could argue is an extreme healthcare situation. And it runs purely on SMS, on text, right? So they text a number and an operator texts them back. There's no chat, they don't have to pick up the phone, they don't have to talk to somebody, and it's enormously effective because it talks to them in a medium that they're very familiar with, that is safe. They can do it in a hidden corner. It works for them. So giving that as a good use of digital technology for a specific outcome, which is enormously helpful. The other end of the scale, I remember being at a conference and listening to two women, one of whom runs IBM's AI across Europe. I think it's called DeepMind. And she happened to be sitting next to a woman who runs Macmillan Cancer Care. And the discussion was really interesting because it was about basically IBM can analyze enormous data sets to deliver more accurate diagnoses, cancer diagnoses, faster than a human doctor ever can, right? That's the way it's going. And the lady from IBM said, but I really wouldn't want my machine telling me I had cancer. I want you to do that because I need empathy, I need care, I need understanding. And that it takes both sides of that, AI and EI, if you like, to make it work properly. So what I would say is that I don't think that you can say that digital is wrong, digital is right. I don't think you can say that face-to-face is wrong, face-to-face is right. I think there is place for all of these things, but what it needs to be driven by, as we've seen in other sectors, is what suits the particular audience segment that we're trying to address. Yeah.
We are an incredibly polite panel. Maya, have you put your hand up there? Well, go ahead, jump in.
What I was going to say was that I've not heard of that Shout app, Ian, but it sounds to me like somebody did some research to figure out what would work with suicidal teenagers, and that was the one that they decided was most appropriate, probably based on feedback, that would deliver the information that they wanted to share and provide the care. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about, that if you, and you've just been saying, if you know your audience and you work with them, then you can be delivering through the right media, can't you?
Yeah.
Do that.
Yeah.
I love that you put your hand up, Maya. That was fantastic. Ian, as a client, as the type of client we might expect to see in more and more in healthcare communications, owning and controlling and communicating about a product that is part of maybe the consumerization of healthcare. What do you want to see from your agency partners and those working in communications?
That's a good question. I think the first thing is what we've just been talking about, which is audience understanding, right? So without that, you can't really hope to deliver the right messages through the right channel to the right people. So I think the first job of communicators in any sector, but especially in healthcare, is going to be understanding who we're talking to and what their needs are, right? And from that, working out what the right channels are and the messaging that needs to be delivered, like the Shout example, I suppose. And I think that is a shift. And it goes to this point about pull, not push. Because it's got to be customer centric rather than organization centric. It's got to be about what do they want to hear, what do they need to know, and let's deliver that in the best way possible, even if it's that, whether that's TikTok or something else. It doesn't matter. But that to me is the big shift.
And I might be shooting myself slightly in the foot, just to touch on. We are all very well. Those of us who work in the pharmaceutical industry, we are trained on the code. We abide by the code. We have to operate within its confines. Clients like Halo is completely different. We do not have to operate there. Do you think at any point that they're, again, potentially shooting myself in the foot, that there is a conservatism in our communications that may hold us back and that we may need to overcome in order to do our best work for a company like Halo?
Yeah, and again, the same analogy applies to other sectors actually, because there are specialist finance communicators, right? So and if they want to work with Monzo, they have to adapt, because it's different to working with Barclays. So and the same would be, you may have to take one approach with Roche and another one with Halo. Because they are operating differently. I think that the knowledge and expertise of specialist communications like Aurora, in terms of understanding the framework within which the regulatory framework, the intermediary framework, all the understanding of the complexity of the market is really important. And that actually is a big advantage to people like agencies like Aurora, providing that there is within that framework the understanding of the need for audience-driven comms and ideas which connect with them. You can't let it be a straitjacket. It has to be a springboard, to use that traditional cliche.
Excellent use of that. I also like the touch of AI plus EI. I'm definitely going to be stealing that for future conversations. Annalise, thinking a little bit there then about kind of the people who are working in healthcare comms and who be working at Real Chemistry, how do you think that we can go about maybe kind of training them differently? What do you think that kind of we need to be educating them on in order kind of to take advantage of this? And you being kind of a leader of a huge group of people in healthcare comms, what would be the priorities of training and what to educate on as we kind of progress into this new period with potential new clients, new opportunities?
I'll touch on three things, and I know it isn't everything, but firstly, I think it starts with a diversity of workforce, and that means diversity in terms of the communities that we're hiring from, because that reflects the communities that we're working with in terms of delivering medicines. And that's really important, because if we don't understand, I think it comes back to what Mayor's saying, don't understand what these communities want, how can we possibly help to serve them? So there's also a diversity in hiring. I think, Nathan, you probably know that for many, many years, we hired from certain types of universities, especially from a scientific perspective. If you'd been to it was a kind of free, not free pass, but it was a pass in. But now, there's such a need for people with scientific understanding and backgrounds. We have an apprentices program, we have an internship program that brings people in perhaps from non-traditional backgrounds or non-scientific backgrounds, where we can take them in and train them either to be highly scientific or know enough science to be dangerous, to be great communicators, because we don't. But I will say, side note, anybody who's going to have kids, encourage them to go and be a medical writer. They will never be out of a job. That would be my top tip from a if you want a job for life. But all jokes aside, very much around the diversification of hiring, but also importantly, what is the training that you put in place to make sure that you are giving people equal opportunities? Because not everybody comes from the same background. So that's not just about the scientific training. It can be how to deal with clients, financial training, how to just deal in social situations. So it's thinking about it in a much kind of more holistic 360 perspective. There's also the diversity of bringing in senior leaders from other businesses. And what we see is, we say we want somebody from Coca-Cola because they understand consumers, and we hire them in and we leave them on an island. We don't give them kind of the safety nets, the lifeboat to help them understand what it's like to do business in the healthcare world. And I think, Ian, you're probably maybe even going through that just as kind of this new owner. Things are different, but we somehow expect people to just suddenly pick it up through osmosis. So there's definitely that, and I'm losing my train of thought, but so there's diversity of hiring. I said 3, didn't I? What was the original question, Nathan?
What kind of training education can we give?
I know, yeah. So the other piece is really like hybrids. So one of the things that we are doing, because we're a very integrated agency, but we do have people in different teams, whether it's kind of analytics and insights, advertising, medcoms, communications, is actually doing hybrid programs, particularly actually when it comes to data and insights, because that's what drives so much of this, where teams will actually get training for, say, 6 months in insights and analytics, and then go back to their comms team. So they learn to understand how to use insights to develop strategies, including platforms, the right content, but also importantly, how to measure and course correct, because we really are in a situation where it's about agile content personalization. And that means quick. We can't actually wait for the MLR process, which can take 2 to 3 weeks. So that's why it's really important we start investing in new technologies as well, so we can speed that whole process up. So there is this personalized experience, which brings me on to the third piece, is just being digital. And we see that probably with the more mature people in our organization. They're not digital natives. They need to be digital natives. They need to understand what the experience is like and how to strategize for it and activate on it. But I do take as well that it isn't only digital. You have to have that personal contact and content. We do know that patients, we do know that HCPs want that. We do know what payers want that. So I count in person as another channel. So those are sorry for my kind of ramblings there.
No, that makes absolute sense. And I think you've touched on a good point in terms of around, we do sometimes expect people to kind of come in and from other industries because we want that perspective, but we don't necessarily maybe give them kind of the time or the training to adapt. I think we've all seen that working in health outcomes, because what we do is very specialized. If we are switching, and for clients such as Halo, where the fundamental goal is sales, the fundamental goal has to be selling a product, which is different to maybe what we are used to working with clients in the pharmaceutical industry. Annalise, do you think there is a challenge there in the fact that our communications goal has to maybe be a little bit different? Do you think there's any sort of blockers or issues doing that as a healthcare comms professional?
I don't think there is, but I do think there is a training and education that goes with that. And that might have been my fourth point. And fun enough, we were doing kind of our top 10 account reviews as a company over the last couple of weeks. And that focus on commercialization, because you do need to bring cures to market. It is about the patient. That should be first and foremost what you're doing, but you do need to make money. And the reason people hire us is to help them make the sales, do what they need to do to get the drugs to market. And that there's different KPIs to measure that. That might be from, how many people you get into the clinical trial, because and how do you get that clinical trial to move more quickly, more effectively, and more impactfully, which then speeds things to kind of medical affairs. What are we doing around MSL? How can we help them understand that drug more quickly? But it all links back to revenue and patient experience. And I think those two are tied together. But I do think a little bit maybe more commercial training wouldn't go amiss.
No, I think that makes sense. It was certainly a change for me. I haven't been working on too many projects that would actually involve fundamentally thinking about the actual, we have to think about the sales goal is the absolute most important, but the end and interaction with the customer. Maya, just to sort of bring you on to that point, do you think in terms of engaging with patients as the final audience, do you think in healthcare communications, we are set up to think about them not only as the distant end user of what we're doing through the pharmaceutical industry, but perhaps more as we have to think about engaging with them from a commercial point as well? Is that something that the Patients Association considers, or is it something do you think is something that healthcare communications is going to have to adapt to get better at?
I think some companies do it quite well, and others think you can come with a fact sheet for patients once it's all been written and gone through MedLeg review and expect, Cancer Research UK to go, yeah, we'll put our logo on it. And that, that's just not going to fly. But that hasn't flown for many, many years. All of the patient organisations, all the patient charities have endorsement policies. And most of those endorsement policies say, we won't endorse anything if we've not been part of developing it. So I think a lot of companies are switched on to that, and I don't think there's anything particularly esoteric about it, and I think it's what I was saying before. It's just about engaging patients. How you engage them is perhaps the knack, about where you find them and how you involve them, how you reimbursement, how they feel about working with pharmaceutical industry, because not everybody loves the pharmaceutical industry despite the vaccines. So what does it mean? And it's about winning their trust, that you're not just taking from them for commercial gain, and that there's nothing in it for them. And by in it for them, I don't mean financially, I mean about improving services, improving outcomes for patient and carers. I think that's what is an issue. But can I just derail the meeting a little bit? I just want to go back to something Annalise said about staff and training. Can I do that, Nathan?
Well, this was my fear factor with you, Maya, that you were going to take this off in a wild direction. But I'm going to be.
No, it's not a wild direction. It's not a wild direction. But
I'm going to be trusting.
Annalise used a word that I think is very interesting about osmosis, and we actually talked about it yesterday, you and I. And I'm interested in Annalise's opinion, and those are the people taking part in this webinar. How has it been when you haven't got osmosis? Can you do osmosis over Teams? What about all those new people, your Coca-Cola guy, Annalise, who's come in? How does that person learn about what it is that we do, that some of us, especially people like me who've been doing it for so many years, take for granted that I know that this is what I need to do, and that these are some of the guardrails that I work within. How's it been? Because I actually think, I hope that this focus on healthcare means that more people are considering a job in healthcare communications, that they see it's an exciting place with a career path. And as Annalise was saying, you know, if you want to stay at home, then, you know, maybe medical writing is the comms that you want to do, because you'll never be short for work. Maybe bored, but you'll never be short for work. So how do we, I suppose the challenge is, how do we train those new people to the industry in a hybrid model where people are going to be working from home? How do you actually support people? I mean, I suppose I'm interested in that, because I think it's a big challenge around bringing together to do the storming, norming and performing.
Maybe I can talk a little bit from personal experience, because I did come into the healthcare industry not knowing anything. I came in as a transformation expert, and I'd literally worked in every other industry except healthcare, but I had worked in tech, which has an awful lot of complicated language that we try and use to bamboozle people into buying things. Mostly it's fake anyway, but not in healthcare. So one of the things that I did coming straight in is I found one or two mentors to help me, one in pharma, one in biotech, because I coming in, I didn't really understand there was a big difference. And obviously there's a significant difference. Those mentors also told me where to go read and learn. And I've always been a news junkie. So the trades, etc., were kind of very important to helping me frame how I understood the industry. And I kind of came at it from a corporate comms perspective, because that was my background. And companies are companies are companies. They've still got balance sheets. They've still got to make numbers for investors. So if you can latch on to something that you know and understand and provide a framework, I think that is helpful. And that's part of kind of setting up, I think, a personalized training program for people coming in, depending on how and where they've come in from. So mine was more corporate comms. So I could start to say, I understand how to do financial PR. I understand to do issues management, thought leadership. They're kind of things that happen in other companies, you know, but what are the core trends, etc., that we would want these people to talk about? And today that might be vaccines, data privacy, it could be Alzheimer's, the growth of Alzheimer's, all kind of, and all cool things that are coming through, access to medicines, and using that. And then I think in terms of technology, what we've seen has been really useful for some of our clients is building knowledge bases on Teams, actually putting up all the relevant information to help people do their jobs, whether that's from kind of administrative perspective, but also as in, here's kind of the subject matter expert you need to know, and here's kind of the campaigns or programs that you need to know to get you up to speed. So I do think it's a combination of mentorship, personalized training, using technology where you can. We're big believers. I tell you, the most people we get on our kind of internal training calls is when we're using case studies. That people always want to know what's going on and how they can learn and cross adapt. And I also think it's giving these new people who perhaps come from Coca-Cola the platform to show why they've come in and why they're important to us. The fact that they perhaps understand consumers and content and channels better than we do, and generally partnering with them with someone who can show their value. That's how I think off the top of my head is a good way, but we have to, because there's not enough people coming through. So we have to help these people be hybrids.
100%. Ian, it'd be interesting to get your take on that, not just as someone as co-founder of Halo, but also in your poacher/gamekeeper role as chief executive of the AML group, in terms of dealing with people coming in from an outside perspective and having to do it in this digital way. You can't just put your arm around the shoulder and sit next to them at a desk.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biotech is obviously a new business, and therefore has been built from scratch, during lockdown, and it was done. But it does have a physical presence, because you've got to have a lab, you've got to have machines, you've got to have people operating machines. So there is a sort of physical aspect to it as well. But quite a lot of the technology, the communications and everything else has been done mostly virtually by people quite often who haven't met, who actually not even all in the same country. And you know, it works. It's the technology means that it can be made to work, and you can select people, train people, onboard people, and let them do their job with the technology. And I think that's great. I think what I've found in the both several businesses really, but particularly in where ideas businesses, which communications should be, I think it's what you see is that individual productivity goes up because people aren't commuting. They haven't got much else to do. If there's lockdown going on, they can be medical writers. They can do lots of things, right? And they can do it extremely efficiently because briefs can be delivered. They can have a Teams meeting. They can move straight on to the next thing without a gap. There's no commute, and so on and so on. So it's very efficient. FDs, in my experience, love it. But what happens is that collective productivity, so the unknown ideas, the chance collisions of thought, the training, the shared culture, the kind of common ethos, if you like, evaporates. Not overnight, but you definitely see an entropy over time, and that it fades away, and it's really, really hard to restore. I mean, we've worked extremely hard to with daily huddles, virtual pubs, you name it. We've tried a lot, and to bring people together, and that has worked to some extent. But there's still limits, and people coming into the into businesses, it's a real struggle, because they just don't have people to learn from directly, face to face, by shadowing them. And I think it's extremely difficult for the generation coming into the workplace now. So I think that yes, the technology is wonderful. Yes, it's possible. Yes, we can be personally productive. And I think that collective productivity is critically important, and we can't let it fade away, because because it does, and it's not seen. It's just like air leaking out, and I think that's really important.
I think that's a good point. I think probably anyone who's worked in agency and has worked in kind of creative ideas businesses probably found that the unknown things that you pick up and learn and adapt as you go, it has been completely lost. This business does work virtually, but when you're not kind of picking things up kind of on the quiet and on the sly, you are lost. I think it's the junior members of our team who maybe have just started or were just starting as the pandemic has come on. They're the ones who have maybe suffered the most, because I think we all kind of learned a lot when we sat next to people who had 10-15 years experience on us, just hearing them how they handle themselves in situations. I think it's something that we're going to have to try and make up for lost time, if we all kind of get back into a hybrid office working. We're heading into the home straight now, got about 20 odd minutes left. If anyone does have any questions from the audience, please put them on the chat, but I still have probably about 3 hours worth of questions, so we'll have no trouble there. One thing we did kind of touch on and then moved on, but I think it's worth going back, is the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry in general. And we have seen perhaps the development of the vaccine has had a positive effect on that, and has shown kind of it has shone a bit of light on the effort that the pharmaceutical industry and the scientific industry actually does day to day. And it maybe shows that the kind of the negative reputation that it has as an industry isn't really validated. Annalise, I'll maybe start with you, but what do you think we can do in communications to help our healthcare and help our pharmaceutical clients to maybe take advantage of this change, and if we can bring some of that goodwill and positivity to kind of show that the vaccine isn't a one-off. They've been doing this for years on a lot of different occasions in a lot of different areas. How do you think we do that in communications that is help them maybe continue that kind of potential positive reputation change?
Well, I think there's two two big areas for me where I think communications can have a big impact moving forward. One is around health equity. I think people are only just beginning to grasp that. And I think the vaccine has been a really good example where it's put the mirror up to not only the pharma companies, but in fact, the state of our kind of, I guess, health knowledge, education, and how we're embracing it, depending on our background, on our experiences and where we came from. So I think there's a huge amount to be done in health equity to make sure that we are operating a truly diverse healthcare system. We have to overcome mistrust. We have to explain the benefits of clinical trials and real world evidence. I think there's an important part of real world evidence. I think some people are getting that from what's been happening with COVID. Genuinely people have become scientifically more aware, which is huge. And I think, the other things that I kind of think about is like mRNA technology. It's a bit like when we were in tech, we say it's the cloud. Now people are talking about mRNA technology. I don't think they really know what it is, but they kind of know it's something and it's special and gradually. So this to me is really huge, that people are scientifically more aware, and that we need to continue to build on that with fact and grounded in science, but bringing those, what I still think is those stories that really resonate, whether it's with the patients, the caregivers, but also importantly with the HCPs and the payers. So it's all about building that story of multiple chapters, not just the one that might impact, say, the drug at launch. I think Maya's really talked about the fact that you have to get patients brought in right from the beginning when that molecule is just on the bench, and how and they have to be part of that journey throughout. And I think that's a really big part of what we need to do, is that journey of a drug coming to market. I think the second part, which is tied in, is around access to medicines, really explaining the value story. And I think if communication's got one thing to do, it's in that area, really understanding how difficult it is, what the payers are up against, these brand new drugs coming to market, rare disease, the impact on rare diseases, the impact with cell gene therapies. People don't really understand, what we're measuring against. How can we help tell that story really effectively? That can help patients champion, can help HCPs champion, so that the payers understand what a critical impact it can have on people's lives. And I also think we're working on some some rare diseases where it's so full of failure, and it's the hope that kills you. And I think this is helping to communicate that you really are a pioneer, and pioneers have to overcome hurdle after hurdle to get things to market. And it's so easy just to think, you hit the first hurdle, like many in rare disease, and people walk away, and you just can't do that for the patient community. You can't. So that's again another wide rambling, but those two things for me is what we need to think about as comms experts, and we have a really strong place to play: equity and access.
No, I think you're right there. I think it's something I've always felt is pharmaceuticals do a lot of things behind the scenes that add huge amount of value that we can't foresee, and that we don't, the general public just doesn't understand. I think it's communicating. I think that value is certainly 100% on us as healthcare communications industry. Ian, to touch on your experiences kind of coming into the healthcare industry quite fresh, did you find there was maybe a prejudice in terms of what you were doing and why you were doing it, and if that was probably ramped up by the fact that the expectation of pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, I mean, I think the let's face it, the testing industry, the new testing industry that's emerged over the last year or so, is a microcosm of that sort of commercialization that we were talking about earlier, and the unregulated growth of that has produced enormous reputational challenges. We just we're one of the founders of a trade organisation which is hopefully representing the firms in the testing sector which have ISO recognition and they have high Trustpilot scores. If you go on the government website for travel testing for COVID, you'll see 400 plus companies. at the top of the list, you'll see .001 aardvark doctors, right? Who, if don't exist. It's a middleman. It's not real. It doesn't have a lab. It doesn't have logistics, and they offer low prices which are unavailable to the public. That's insane, right? It's just kind of wrong, and that's why, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector, regulation is necessary, but it needs to be enforced as well. Like at the moment, we're sequencing 100% of positive tests through UCL, and you read in the papers that only 4% of positives are being sequenced. Well, that must be ours then, because is nobody else being made to do this? They should be. And that sort of Wild West unregulated market is perhaps a suggestion of what could happen if the pharmaceutical industry went completely commercial without a regulatory framework. That's why it's necessary, right? That's why it has to be in place, and that's why those constraints, if you like, that framework needs to be there. And it's massively frustrating if you're trying to do a good job in a sector when there's a lot of people who are not doing a good job, and that compromises everybody's reputation. I mean, that frankly is one of the biggest takeouts from the last year, that you can do all the right things, but if those around you are not, then you're in a lot of trouble. And that's why this sector, more than any others, which has sort of huge impact on people's lives and health, does need that framework around it.
I think you've touched on a good point. I think it links even to agency life, is that one agency can take on a lot of these learnings and how we handle our teams and employees differently and put the patient first. But if every agency doesn't do it, it doesn't kind of bring on that change that we need to see. Maya, just to bring it back to the patient a little bit, and obviously we've seen 18 months of high focus on science. People are maybe, as Annalise said, learning about things like mRNA and picking up on little bits of science, maybe more than they previously wouldn't have done. And they've seen massive advances in science in terms of what the pharmaceutical and scientific industry can do. And it's all been on the front page. It's all been on the first segment in the 10 o'clock. Do you think that's maybe changed the perspective of patients and what they think can be achieved? And do you think there'll be any maybe backlash? And is there a way that we in communications can counter that?
I think it's going to be important from patients' perspective as to what happens next, so to speak. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens this winter. Are we going to have this flu epidemic that they're, talking up? Because there's been some research that suggests that trust in pharmaceutical companies has risen because of the work that was done to make vaccines available so quickly. But we were all clapping for the NHS a few months ago, and we're not clapping for them now. The Daily Mail is after GPs in a big way this week. So it doesn't take a great deal of disappointment for people's trust to be eroded. And I think that's what you need to think about in the immediate future. What's going to happen with delivery of services, all services, and how we in healthcare comms can explain coherently what the delay is. So you can't have your operation this week, or you can't have this treatment. Why is that? What happens next? How do you look after yourself while you're waiting for treatment? I think those are all really, really important things. But I think also one of the changes that we need to perhaps encourage and embed is, with the speed in which the vaccines were approved and regulated in this country, it does show that regulation doesn't need to take months and months and months. And if, June Rain from the MHRA is going to say that all of these vaccines were properly regulated, but what happened was it was all working in parallel, why can't we do that for everything? When I was listening to sort of the big teams talking, a lot of the people who were in the regulatory part of the pharmaceutical companies that were delivering the vaccine said, you know, a lot of their job is just about form filling. And Ian mentioned it at the very beginning. Have we seen now a way to deliver quality medicines at speed to patients that need them? And if we have, and it works, can we do more of it?
Hopefully we can. I think that's going to be the challenge. It's going to be, if we can, people are going to be looking upon the fact that things have gone quicker than normal, and there have been these evolutions have taken a lot faster.
So from my personal perspective, you can't tell me that the vaccines were safely delivered, and a lot of the people who are vaccine hesitant have been hesitant because it has been delivered so quickly. When, you know, we've been telling people for years it takes 15 years for a drug to come to market, haven't we? So you can't then say, oh, we have to go back to this way, because then you immediately cast out on the approvals of the vaccines. Now, I'm pretty sure that those vaccines were thoroughly tested, proper approvals process. And I think that willingness to work in a different way should be now moved elsewhere. And I think there's a job of communications around that if we can convince the regulators to do it.
Fingers crossed we can. Coming up to our final questions. Ian, one for you. As operating the sort of business that might be some of the new work we might find in healthcare comms in this post-pandemic period, what do you want to see from your agencies? What do you want to see more of? How do you kind of want to be pushed as a client in this space by your agencies?
I think that it's sort of what we were talking about earlier, which is the understanding the point from the audience's point of view rather than the provider's point of view, and being almost an advocate for what they need. So, you know, which is hard because you've got a lot of audiences, some direct, some indirect, and you know, there's a huge amount of segmentation to be done there. But I think that is what it should drive, and then using that knowledge to have ideas. You know, I mean, that's the most important thing. So to say, look, you know, here is this this new product that we need to communicate to these groups, and here is a way of doing so, which is not necessarily driven by just rational fact. It's driven by emotional understanding of that audience and how they might respond to it, and an idea which kind of maybe inspires them to act, to choose, to make an informed choice of one product over another. And I think that's it's you know, that should be very exciting, I think, for healthcare comms agencies and people in them.
I think it definitely is, and it's having the opportunity to do the sort of work we're doing for Halo is different to some of the work we might do for other clients, and it all bleeds into one another. Working for one type of client will fundamentally help.
And all at very high speed, Nathan.
Well, exactly. Again, it's got my work rate up. I can certainly tell you that. I was terribly lazy.
Well, this probably counts as a day off for you, doesn't it?
I'll get this. I'll be getting this back as loo time. Like, don't worry about that. Final questions for all of you, and it will be the same one. You all have a tremendous amount of experience working in healthcare communications, and you have done it so in different generations and working in communications in general. If we are heading into a potential industrial revolution, I'm going to keep kind of using that, Annalise, that's getting stolen, for healthcare and healthcare comms. What's your one bit of advice, each of you, for people who are entering this industry or who are working in this industry, and how do they need to adapt? Annalise, I will start with you.
Thank you. I think you might have heard me say this before, Nathan, but honestly, I think the best advice is to stay curious. I mean that both in terms of being a healthcare communicator, I mean in your career, and I mean in your personal life. The more that you continue to learn and grow and develop your skills, you'll be golden. And really, I think people who are curious often it comes about because of passion and ambition. So I think if you genuinely love your work and you can see that you're making a difference, that's the sort of people you want to hire. So I'm hiring, not hiring because you're a great scientist. I'm hiring because you're curious, passionate, and have ambition. And that's why I want to stay with you as well. And that's what we have in the team internationally. And it's what gets me up every day. So I'm excited. I just think we are at the start of something amazing in terms of what we can do as healthcare communicators, how we can drive forward from an economic, societal, but mostly from a patient perspective. And those patients are going to be us and our families moving forward. So I think we've actually got a real moment to kind of define our own lives moving forward. So
Maya, what is your bit of advice to people coming to healthcare comms as we enter this new period?
I think you have to accept, if you're going to enter healthcare communications, that you have to know quite a lot about quite a lot of subjects. It's not perhaps as narrow a field as it once was. And, so I remember a few years ago, you'd have all of us steeped in the ABPI code, and then you'd have one solitary person who did digital. Well, now we all need to understand digital, and the digital person needs to understand the ABPI code as well. And I think it stretches across. So I think it's an interesting and varied profession where you can work in a whole range of different settings to provide outstanding communications, either for your company or for your client, that ultimately benefit patients.
And Ian, final word from you.
Yeah, I think I like all that. I like curious as a word. That's that's great, and I like soul as a word that I think Annalise used earlier as well. To me, the most important thing is being human, actually, about it, because the machines can do a lot of communicating now. You can get AI programs that will write copy. But the thing that they can't do is connect with other people in the same way, and using empathy, using EI, using soul, call it what you like. But that is the most important quality, I would say, for people working in this kind of industry.
That's a lovely way to finish this session, and we're pretty much finishing bang on time as well. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Annalise. Thank you, Ian. You have been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everyone who has attended. We have recorded this session as well, and I'm sure it will be shared out sometime. So if you wish to share with your friends, family, whoever, please go ahead and do so. Thank you to everyone who's helped organise the session. Thank you to Vulio, and thank you to the PRCA. But no, that was absolutely brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you later.